Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Ghost Writers, the Moists on Religion. As we've seen in the last two episodes, the Moists thought that it would almost never be acceptable to start a war. The only exception they recognized was the so-called punitive campaign, which should bring benefit to the population involved. Such a justified war would ideally be accompanied by a go-ahead from the spirit world. When the Lord Tang was considering war against the tyrant Jie, the sun and the moon did not appear on time. Cold weather and hot came mixed together. The 5 grains withered and died. Ghosts howled throughout the state. Cranes cried for more than 10 nights. Just in case this message was too subtle, Tang was then instructed directly by heaven that Jie had lost his mandate and that he should go and punish them. As divine portents go, that's about as clear as it gets. The stars in the sky might as well have rearranged themselves to spell out, "Dear Tang, now would be a good time to declare war. Best wishes, heaven." Tang duly launched his war, deposed Jie, ruled with virtue, and brought benefit to the people. The modern reader is apt to be disconcerted by the Mozi's apparently fervent belief in such supernatural events. Coming from the traditionally minded Confucians to the Moists, we found them remarkably ready to critique established ideas and values. Expensive funerals and music are a waste of time and money. Warfare is not noble, but just a bigger version of stealing fruit from your neighbor's garden. Don't aspire to live in an elegant house, just build a modest structure and then stop. Yet when it comes to the workings of heaven and the existence and workings of ancestral spirits, or ghosts, the Moists seem all too ready to give credence to folk beliefs. Nor is this only an anachronistic reaction from a modern secular point of view. Even later, during the Han period, the Moists were accused of contradicting themselves with their apparently conflicting views on ghosts and funerals. They encourage generous offerings to the ancestral spirits, yet pinch every penny when ancestors die in the first place. Is it really possible to integrate the apparently superstitious elements of the Mozi into its soberly rational, consequentialist ethics? The Moists themselves thought so, of course. As we discussed in previous episodes, heaven is so central to their ethical conception that some have wondered whether the Moists believed that the principle of inclusive care is rooted in a divine command. Though we resisted that suggestion, it's clear that heaven's intent is an unimpeachable standard of right action. We are meant to take a lesson from the way it punishes the bad and rewards the good, especially when it comes to treatment of the commoners. Furthermore, while the Emperor, or Son of Heaven, outranks all other humans, he's outranked by heaven itself. So it is the highest role model in the Moist project of identifying upward. Of course, while heaven metes out benefit to the people cannot do the same in return. Thus, as the Mozi notes, the Emperor makes offerings to heaven and the ghosts, beseeching them for favors, but we do not see heaven returning the favor by praying to the Emperor. In this sense, heaven lies beyond calculations of benefit. Nothing can harm it or help it. But the same is not true of ghosts. The Moists assume that they do benefit from our offerings, which is why we saw it arguing that warfare is harmful to ghosts. War strains resources to such an extent that ritual offerings cannot be made as usual. This might be one reason the Mozi often refers to the ghosts as being in the middle. They can act as arbiters of justice, like heaven above, but can receive benefit, like us below. In this respect, Moist consequentialism is unlike the more recent variations we have mentioned. Modern-day utilitarians, like Peter Singer, have extended the theory to include non-human animals. But few philosophers nowadays would argue that we need to extend the circle of concern to people who are already dead. More common would be the idea that we should factor future people into our calculations, since we do things now that will cause them benefit or harm later on, like protect the environment or destroy it. If today's consequentialists fail to consider the welfare of ghosts, there's a good reason for that. They don't believe in them. One might assume that this attitude would have been unthinkable in warring stage China, when belief in ancestral spirits was both widespread and an important part of religious practice. The most non-religious stance on offer, you might think, would be what we find in the Confucians. We saw them respectfully keeping the spirits at arm's length, but not actually challenging their existence. In fact, though, the Mozi does find it thinkable that someone might refuse to accept the reality of ghosts, and aims a whole series of arguments against this position. It's not entirely clear whether Mozi's opponent is merely hypothetical or is meant to represent real-life skeptics. In favor of the former option, the critic's supposed challenges are actually more like a series of leading questions that allow Mozi to unfold his own account. For instance, at one point, the critic simply asks for textual evidence to show that the sage kings believed in ghosts and sacrificed to them. You can almost hear Mozi thinking, "So glad you asked," as he unfurls a series of well-prepared citations and quotations. On the other hand, the authors of the Mozi do seem to be worried about real skeptics too. It blames those who reject the ghosts for causing societal chaos. Like Santa Claus, the ghosts know when you've been bad and good, so be good for goodness sake. Even hiding yourself away in dark forests will not conceal you from their view, nor is it possible to hide from heaven. So, the sage kings disseminated teachings about these supernatural forces to bring people in line, staying on their best behavior even when no one, or no human, is watching. One might say that the prospect of reward and punishment from heaven and spirits plays a role for Mozi like that played by ritual in the Xunzi. As we saw, Xunzi's chapter on that topic begins by saying that the sage kings introduced ritual to stem the tide of disorder caused by conflicting desires. Likewise, in Moism, a widespread acceptance of the need to propitiate ghosts and earn reward from heaven is a powerful basis for a well-running society. It's tempting to say that if the ghosts didn't exist, the sage kings would have had to invent them. Or is that exactly what did happen? Perhaps the Moa's credulity when it comes to popular religion is not what it seems. Our feeling of discomfort at their superstition could be dispelled by saying that they only think it is useful for people to believe in these things. After all, they are consequentialists, so it could be in keeping with their own ethical principles to support beliefs because they are useful rather than because they are true. On this reading, the evidence brought forward about the sage kings sacrificing to ghosts does not show what the sages themselves thought, but what they wanted everyone else to think. The underlying assumption would be that people cannot be trusted to practice inclusive care simply for the sake of increasing benefit. Instead, they have to be threatened with divine wrath and offered the bait of divine reward. This may seem like a perverse interpretation of a text whose declared purpose is to defend the reality of ghosts, but perhaps the underlying motivation is that the skeptics are undermining a very useful set of religious tenets, rather than that the skeptics are saying something false. And there is at least one moment where the Mozi explicitly justifies belief in ghosts on consequentialist grounds. This comes when it is considering what is probably the most powerful objection raised by the hypothetical critic, powerful because it invokes the Moist's own ethical criteria. The critic complains that offering wine and grain to the ghosts is wasteful. Obviously, this challenge cannot be ignored, and for precisely the reason noted in that ancient criticism of the Moists, they were ready to cut corners when it came to funerals for the sake of thrift, so why not do the same with offerings? To this objection, Mozi responds that even if there were no ghosts, the ceremonies would still be beneficial, because people get to eat food at these events, and the rituals serve to bind the community together. This is a remarkable response, and for a couple of reasons. First, it seems to justify ancestral offerings on the same grounds invoked by Xunzi, namely that rituals have good social effects. Second, the authors of the Mozi may here be tipping their hand. They have come out and said that it doesn't really matter whether there are ghosts. What matters is that people act as if ghosts are real. This may remind us of a tantalizingly ambiguous piece of advice we found in the Confucian Analects. When sacrificing to the spirits, you should comport yourself as if the spirits were present. Of course, one passage in the Mozi is a rather slender thread on which to hang an agnostic reading of these chapters about ghosts. And even in this passage, Mozi is certainly not denying that ghosts exist. He is saying that the ghosts do exist, but even if they didn't, making offerings would still not be a waste of resources. Still, let's keep an open mind, because there is additional evidence that the Moist teachings on religion were devised to maximize benefit rather than truth. This comes in another set of 3 chapters devoted to the topic of fate. Here their concern is that belief in fate may make people lazy. For both the powerful rulers and the common folk, it's disastrous to think that one's efforts make no difference. Farmers will not try to grow crops, and rulers will not govern with virtue, since all will assume that good and bad things are sent by heaven, and that we paltry humans have no influence in the world. So fatalism is like warfare. It goes against the interests of heaven above, the ghosts in the middle, and humans below. Who is the target of this polemic? Apparently, the Confucians, who did at least flirt with determinism or fatalism. Remember, a central worry of the early Confucians was to explain why the great Kongzi had been unable to reform his society. One way to excuse him was to say that heaven, or fate, did not intend for him to succeed. The Analects itself says, if the way is practiced, that is fate. If the way is abandoned, that is fate. Similarly, Mozi is presented as accepting his political failures cheerfully on the grounds that the time was simply not right for his ambitions to be realized. Still, it seems a caricature of the Confucian view to accuse them of thoroughgoing fatalism. Indeed, the Mozi more or less admits as much, since it accuses the Confucians of contradicting themselves by encouraging us to make efforts towards virtue despite their ideas about fate. One might more fairly say that for the Confucians, fate, or heaven, is deeply inscrutable. We cannot understand its plans or reasons, if any, but must simply accept whatever fate sends. Our task is to do our best with the limited number of things we can control. For the Moist, by contrast, heaven does not move in mysterious ways. It is a predictable force, one we know will act in accordance with the principle of inclusive care. So, fate does not determine that some times are right for tyranny and some for virtuous rule. After all, in the very time when Jie was a tyrant, Tang was able to rise up and overthrow him. Of course, the spirit world did get involved, what with all the withering grains, howling ghosts, and crying cranes, but it was still up to Tang to take matters into his own hands. So, for the Moists, we need to thank heaven for its just and beneficent regime while also accepting responsibility for our actions within that regime. The Moists write, "Not so much as the tip of a hair is not heaven's doing, and the benefits the people get from these things can be said to be great indeed. Yet for them alone not to repay heaven without knowing they are being unbenevolent and inauspicious, this is what I call the gentleman understanding the little things, but not understanding the big things." Which brings us back to our question, how exactly do we come to understand all this rightly? On what grounds do we form our beliefs about supernatural matters? Is it simply useful for people to think that heaven acts with predictable righteousness, just as it is useful if people believe in ghosts who mete out justice? Well, not according to the Mozi itself. To the contrary, it speaks of not one, but 3 tests, measures, or models that we should use to form and test our beliefs. We mentioned these tests back in episode 24, but they're going to be crucial in what follows, so here's a recap. They are set out in a passage from the chapters on fate, which reads as follows. How do we confirm it? Confirm it against the deeds of the former sages and great kings. How do we source it? Examine the reality the common people's ears hear and eyes see. How do we use it? Issue it as government policy in the state. Examine the myriad people and observe it. These are called the 3 models. The Mozi is saying that we should start from the teachings of the sage kings. These have been handed down as writings on silk and bamboo and as inscriptions on metal, stone, and ceremonial bowls. These records show that the sages rejected fate, and also that they took very seriously the need to sacrifice to ghosts as well as to heaven. But this historical research is not enough. We should also look to universal experiences, notably including those of the common folk. As the Mozi says, no one has ever reported seeing or hearing fate. You might respond that people don't see or hear ghosts either, but actually that isn't true as far as the Mozi is concerned. Remember the spiritual apparitions that have licensed the occasional punitive war. Besides, people generally acknowledge the reality of the spirits and make sacrifices to them, so we should too. Only as a 3rd step does the usefulness of the belief come into play. We should lay down a certain doctrine, as the sage kings did before us, and then observe whether it conforms to the benefit of the state, the 100 clans, and the people. This 3rd criteria of use is like a final test for a belief we already have every reason to hold. Both the sage kings and people in general think ghosts exist and reject fatalism, and these are powerful considerations. The fact that these beliefs are also useful simply completes what was already a strong case. How so? At some risk of circularity, we might speculate that it is because heaven sees to it that the right doctrines produce the best results. Conversely, wrong doctrines produce terrible results. Fatalism, for example. But again, its harmfulness is only one reason to deny it. Every time a farmer gets up first thing in the morning to plow his field, or a good ruler takes pains to govern justly, they are showing how convinced they are that their actions will have some tangible effect. So just as there is widespread belief in ghosts, there's widespread disbelief in fatalism. Furthermore, we can provide an error theory to explain where the idea of fatalism came from in the first place. Not from the sage kings, like our beliefs about ghosts and heaven. Rather, it was the bad rulers who invented it as an excuse for the dire results of their corrupt government. For the same reason, we should hesitate before embracing another line of interpretation that has been applied to the Mozi. It has been suggested that this is a naturalist text, similar to other Warring States literature and comparable to the Han Feizi, which we'll get to later when we come to legalism. The thought here is that in Moism, heaven is not so much a deity, a supernatural enforcer of moral norms, as another name for those very moral norms. Heaven and ghosts are fully integrated into nature and are really just a name for the way the good wind up getting rewarded and the bad punished. Insofar as this is a religious belief, it would be religious only in the sense of believing that the natural world functions predictably, fairly, and justly. Compared to the idea that the Moists make usefulness the sole litmus test for belief, this reading seems to have a lot more going for it. It's certainly true that the Moist conception of heaven is not that of a capricious or unpredictable God. Even the ancestral spirits act in regular ways, responding benevolently to those who give them offerings. Moist religion, if we can call it that, is reassuring in its teaching that everyone gets what they deserve, sooner or later. But it seems problematic to think of them as making a naturalistic adjustment to traditional beliefs. After all, traditional beliefs, from both the sage kings and common folk, are invoked as the primary confirmation and source for everything the Moists say about heaven and ghosts. The occasional Confucian fatalist or ghost skeptic may get things wrong, but the Moists are convinced that you cannot fool all of the people, all of the time. Though we've rejected the idea that beliefs are accepted solely for their practical benefit, we don't want to suggest that Moist epistemology has nothing to do with the question of how to live. When the so-called later Moists explored the methods of dialectical argumentation and produced writings on this topic that found their way into the Mozi, they remained deeply committed to the project of maximizing benefit. They wanted to teach their readers how to use words and concepts correctly so as to avoid being right about the small things and wrong about the big ones, as the Mozi likes to put it. Skipping a podcast episode might seem like a small thing, but it would be a big mistake indeed if you chose not to join us for all that next time here on The History of Philosophy in China.